As the leadership race conversation continues to heat up, it's increasingly looking like Andy Burnham is the guy.
Well, Makerfield by-election pending, of course. We all know he's got a fight on his hands against reform.
Meanwhile, Wes Streeting has been out and about, touting the idea of a Brexit do-over, and Keir Starmer is very much staying put.
And what's the mood like in the very end days of a number 10? Spoiler, actually surprisingly fun. And that's what we'll be discussing today.
I'm Helen MacNamara, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary.
And I'm Cleo Watson, a former Special Advisor to Theresa May and Boris Johnson.
And this is In the Room.
So before we get into it, we'd love it if you follow us on Instagram, where you can find all the best bits of the show. Our handle there is @intheroom.pod. And you can also watch us on YouTube in full Technicolor. Our channel is called In the Room Politics.
If you've got a burning question, or if you want to just send us some fan mail, you can email us these days on intheroom@independent.co.uk.
So let's get cracking. Over the weekend, Wes Streeting was speaking at the Progress think tank's conference, where he announced ahead of an actual leadership contest that he will be a runner. And he also outlined that he would like Britain to rejoin the EU and that Brexit has been a disaster.
So Wes's comments have been met with criticism, including from his own party, in fact quite strongly from his own party, particularly from Lisa Nandy, who's the Culture Secretary on the Laura Kuenssberg show.
All right, here's what she had to say.
I actually think this is just a bit odd. I listened to what Wes had to say very carefully yesterday, and I know that he's got a strong view about this and always has had, that we shouldn't have left the European Union. And, you know, frankly, that's one that I share. I campaigned for Remain. I think it was a mistake, and I think the Brexit deal has been a real problem for us. But I don't really understand why the sudden focus on Europe. We're already, as a government, trying to repair in a pragmatic way the needless damage that was done by that poor Brexit deal to people's living standards in towns like mine, without reopening the circular arguments that we ended up in as a country.
Gosh, she's good, isn't she? You
She
do
is.
think, you know, we all this talk about a man in the Northwest. Why don't we have a woman in the Northwest standing? But she's not being touted at all as leader. She's like a good communicator. I think she made the very, very strong case against Wes Streeting's position just then, better than anyone else in government has been able to do.
Yes, and look, we will get on, more to come on what we think about what Wes said about Brexit and where that leaves everybody. Following the news that Andy Burnham will be standing in Makerfield, which everybody has now agreed to pronounce Makerfield as well, which I'm personally very pleased about. But Keir Starmer has said that he will back a Labour candidate 100%, whomsoever that candidate may be. Whether that is a blessing or curse remains to be seen.
And he's right to say that, because this is going to be an incredibly tough race against reform, and Labour need to be really united here, because whoever it is, most likely Andy Burnham, has got a hell of a fight on their hands.
Burnham has pushed back quite strongly on the Wes Streeting we should rejoin the EU point, and said that his agenda will have a relentlessly domestic focus.
And then meanwhile, Keir Starmer, who is actually still Prime Minister, by the way, continues to get on with his job. He's in tortoise mode, as we've discussed on Friday. He said, "I'm focused on the job that I was asked to do, which is to serve my country and to carry out my duties as Prime Minister of the country." And we're going to talk a little later on about what is to come in the coming weeks for him, because it's actually not as gloomy as you might think.
It was not helpful of Wes Streeting to have opened the Brexit debate in his speech on Saturday. And let's not forget that much as actually Andy Burnham is positioning his by-election fight, and there's a lot of talk in Labour, this is a kind of big battle of ideas. This is it's Labour versus Reform. It's a heavyweight versus heavyweight competition. Actually, this is also the Labour Party punching itself in the face and being mean to each other again. And Wes Streeting standing there on a public platform and trying to reopen the debate around Brexit, when the battle in question at the moment is a constituency which is very heavily voted to leave, is not a useful or helpful thing to do to his former colleague and friend Andy Burnham. So it's definitely drawing of a big red line, I would say. He was pretty strong in his language, Wes Streeting, at this speech. He said Brexit was a catastrophic mistake. And something that really caught my eye and made me laugh, Cleo, thinking of you and some of our friends, was that he said that Vote Leave, who obviously, pantomime villains for people like Wes Streeting, had thought that England could forge, or the UK could forge, a global free trade nirvana, and that the assumption of Vote Leave had been that the East India Company was still at our disposal, which, of all of the weird comments, I just thought was a ridiculous thing to say.
Yeah, it was just a weird way to put it. Why not talk about the big red bus, which makes a lot more sense to people? Andy Burnham has a very specific electorate to be speaking to. And, we have looked at this before. 65% of them voted Leave in the EU referendum in 2016. 50% of them voted Reform a couple of weeks ago in the local elections. I would say, contrasting with that, Wes Streeting is laser focused on Labour MPs, Labour members, southern, wealthier. I mean, that's where the kind of core Labour vote is heading now. Southern, wealthier, rejoin Remainer types. So he can afford to do this, but it's a massive problem for Andy Burnham. Wes Streeting is just saying what he thinks on stage. He's saying, as you pointed out, quite weird inflammatory stuff that is basically quite insulting. And lots of Labour MPs have said to various journalists over the weekend, number one, how catastrophically unhelpful. Number two, you couldn't make us look more sort of insulting that we're telling people who voted for Leave and who in fact are our kind of bread and butter voters that they're wrong and they're ignorant and that we're still not listening to the message they were actually trying to give us by voting Leave in the first place.
Yeah, because let's not forget, the actual by-election here is an absolute head-to-head battle between Labour and Reform. And there are two there's the Brexit problem, but there is also the kind of talking down our country, not patriotic, what makes you think that we need the EU. Actually, there is a real boosterism thing. There's a very boosterism thing about the way that Andy Burnham talks about the UK, actually, and talks about Manchester and talks about the best that we could be. So I think Wes Streeting made a mistake in that as well. The other thing that is really problematic about what Wes Streeting said and the way he set his stall out, there are people, and, the Conservative opposition are very high on this list of people who will, if the Prime Minister changes, who will say, this is an outrage, there ought to be a general election, the country voted for Keir Starmer, please give us a general election because it's fairly and squarely in their interest to do so. The best argument against that is, actually, we haven't changed any of the policies in our manifesto. This is the same guy, same old government, slightly better version, new and improved, 2.0, different guy, but same thing. The Labour manifesto for 2024 is crystal clear about not rejoining the EU. It's crystal clear about a whole series of red lines, which frankly, Keir Starmer's come quite close to getting, talking about dynamic alignment for those of you Brexit nerds. He's come quite close to, wanting to ask questions about the customs union or various other bits of the arrangement with Europe in recent weeks. But it is super unhelpful for Wes Streeting to be saying that actually the Labour Prime Minister or the Labour leader should go against what the country voted for.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, let's cast our minds back to the 2019 general election, which was like another run at, we'd had a few years then, 3 years of various people who'd voted Remain trying to forge a rejoin or a second referendum. But actually, Boris Johnson won that general election with a very straightforward 3-word slogan: get Brexit done. Now, debate on whether that is actually what he followed through on, and people can talk until the cows come home about whether the deal he eventually got was the right one and a good one. But one of Labour's catastrophic weaknesses in that general election was that they didn't really have their story straight on Brexit. And therefore, lots of the people, including people in Makerfield, who might have been lifelong Labour supporters, did go with Boris Johnson because they thought, this guy gets it, and then 2024, change. Yes, that's what I want. And it's still not happening. And so reopening this whole thing is just a massive, massive mistake.
And it just sounds so self-indulgent. Yeah. Because the other thing is, this isn't a question about going back to 2016 and would have, should have, could have done something different. The question that we'd have to think about now is, do we want to rejoin the EU? So that is different to, should we have stayed in the first place? And one of the things that I don't think is often understood, and you and I have had this conversation over the years, is that actually, it didn't quite fit neatly on a poster, and I don't know why the campaign didn't make more of this at the time, but we had such a sweet deal with the EU in 2015. So David Cameron's team had negotiated a much better deal, but already the UK was in a special category of, we didn't have the same rules of free movement. We did have much more flexibility about all sorts of things. We'd used the geographic convenience of having a bit of sea between us and France to opt out of all sorts of things. So it was massively financially advantageous, which, by the way, why some people in the EU were super keen to see the back of us, because we were getting a really good deal. Yeah. And we will not be offered, if we ever had to or wanted to join the EU, we'd have to go on bended knee and be given we'd get clattered around the head, I think.
Absolutely. I remember David Cameron, when he got his renegotiated deal in February 2016, I was working on the Vote Leave campaign, and we had this campaign meeting, and we all said, this is a good deal. But obviously that wasn't in line with our campaign.
Don't remember you saying that.
Yeah. But they didn't make anything of it. They didn't talk about the merits of the deal. And it just sort of disappeared from the national conversation within days. And that is with the full heft of the Remain campaign and the government communications machine behind it. And we were, we were a pretty ragtag group who'd been able to just not talk about this deal. You're right. And actually, the public understand this too. There's a sort of quantitative and qualitative question here. Pollsters can ask broad swathes of people, if you took a time machine back to 2016, how would you vote now? And actually, quite a lot of people would now vote Remain. That does include, obviously, kind of new people coming into the electorate. Obviously, people who were not of the voting age in 2016 now are, that kind of thing. But when you ask on a more qualitative measure in focus groups, say, would you like to rejoin? And then you explain exactly as you've just set out what that means and the position that we're coming from. And particularly, if you mention free movement, people change their minds.
Absolutely. And, it's worth saying that's probably not necessarily going back to the precise terms of whether we're better or worse off in the EU. One of the big things that's changed since 2016 is the kind of revealed incompetence of our governing. And that goes straight to the heart of this battle of ideas that Andy Burnham is now having, is what kind of country do we want to be? Who are we as a nation? And there are some really big arguments about where we've gone wrong. There's a ridiculous argument going on about Andy Burnham has said something in his very good, by the way, election communications, his party political stuff. It's not party political, but it's really, really good.
With elbow in the background.
With
it's very
elbow
hard-lifting.
and Oasis. It's like 1990s Redux in an absolutely brilliant way for some of us. But he's got this thing about, the country's been going wrong for 40 years and everyone's been going crackers about that because it's like, 1986 was peak, was it? And there is a bit of, and he's been part of all of these governments, but there is just as Lisa and Andy said in that clip, that some of the problems that we are seeing today have really, really, really long roots. And so, as you and I have said a few times, the Brexit vote is a symptom, not necessarily a cause. It's a cause of all sorts of other things, but it is also people saying, actually, I just don't think this works. I should say, if we're allowed to keep this into the edit, that we are coming up to the 10th anniversary of the Brexit referendum quite soon. And Cleo and I have got some quite exciting plans of what we might do and what we might bring you, just to try to give you a little bit of in the room from both Cleo's point of view, obviously in the Vote Leave campaign, but also speaking to some people on the Remain side too. Should we talk a bit about our friend Andy? Our friend in the north, Andy Burnham.
Yes, let's. Okay, well, should we begin with, Andy Burnham is very popular, particularly within the Labour Party. So a YouGov poll that has just come out of Labour voters found that 47% of them would vote for Burnham, versus 37% for Wes Streeting and 8% for Angela Rayner. But it gets much more interesting in head-to-head. So he beats everybody in a head-to-head, and Wes Streeting doesn't beat anybody, including Keir Starmer.
I mean, we'll talk about this, I imagine, over the coming weeks before the by-election on June the 18th. But there is a groundswell of quite sensible voices saying, actually, if Andy Burnham can demonstrate that he wins this on June the 18th, and he's basically won the battle of ideas with reform, then there shouldn't be a long Labour leadership contest. He should be effectively crowned in the same way that they handed over power from Blair to Brown.
Yeah, a matter of days.
Perhaps, hopefully, a slightly more successful version of that, Andy would say. And then, we're at the races again with a different Prime Minister with some energy underneath them. It sounds like a really, ridiculously insidery thing to say. I guess that's why we're here. But the difference between becoming Prime Minister at the end of June and becoming Prime Minister at the end of September is much more than those 3 months would suggest. It's really, in terms of his ability to get cracking, get up and running, use the period of the summer, particularly summer recess when Parliament's not there, to do lots and lots of work and be able to get those months, that will be worth solid gold in terms of where the Labour Party have got to before the next election. So if you're somebody who would like Labour to win the next election and Andy Burnham wins the vote on June the 18th, then you should be arguing for, let's not have like 3 months of the Labour Party knocking spots off each other, undermining their credibility further, having ridiculous arguments like this one Wes Streeting started last weekend, and let's just get going.
Not least because we've talked at length about the cost of living crisis, and going into winter that will feel so much worse. So having time over the summer to prepare for what are major problems. And Andy Burnham has said he's going to have an aggressively domestic agenda, so it's the obvious time to get cracking. And it's good for the government. You know, he's got all these relationships with the civil service to repair. Why not use the summer to do that rather than conference period, which is great.
Conference period. Cleo had a little flash of panic about conference period there.
Yeah. Can I also just go into my own private bit on Andy Burnham, what I really felt for him on Saturday when he was filmed running along a dual carriageway.
Is this Andy Burnham in his short shorts?
Oh my Lord, are they short? But I just thought, poor you've gone out for a run. I really don't think it was one of those stage ones, because you'd have really thought the outfit through a bit better. And it reminded me of those pictures of Boris Johnson when he used to go out running, and quite often in brogues, like his work shoes and swimming trunks, which, if you've worn swimming trunks, there's mesh in there. That's chafe central. I don't know what he was thinking.
I think, to be fair to Andy Burnham, is slightly more of a runner in many senses than Boris Johnson. But I think that was Andy Burnham has spent most of his adult life, if not all of his adult life, in politics. He will never have come up against what he's facing now. And I think that that's what he'll see in the by-election period, in terms of the scrutiny, in terms of the paparazzi, in terms of every single minute or second of his life, everything he's ever said is going to be entirely crawled over. And it's a bit like, welcome to your new life. Do you really want this? And you do feel a bit for him. There's been many pictures of him now slightly wearing longer shorts going for his run, which is, well done, Andy.
Well done, PR people.
Well done, PR people. But it is a new reality.
Well,
which
and he's
in.
already being accused of, without having actually announced anything yet, he's already being accused of U-turns. So, in response to Wes Streeting's Brexit comments, Andy Burnham actually repeated what he's already said, essentially. He said a year ago, I would love to rejoin the EU in my lifetime. And this weekend, after Wes Streeting said we should rejoin, he said, maybe one day, but I just don't think that is on the agenda right now. There are other things to be getting on with, much like Lisa and Andy on the BBC. And similarly, he has said that he would abide by Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules too. And it's almost like the chance of governing creeping up on you means you can't just sort of say what you want, because if you remember, he said in the autumn that the government should not be in hock to the bond markets, which is tricky because that's who we borrow from.
Yeah, you don't have to be in hock for them, but you do have to hope that they believe in what you're doing, for sure. There's a very old Labour, new Labour joke about Andy Burnham, which is a Blairite, a Brownite and a Corbynite walk into a bar. The barman says, "Hello, Andy."
Okay, I'm not denying that isn't a cracker.
It's a great joke.
But nothing's funnier than explaining a joke. So perhaps you could explain it.
The joke is getting at, Cleo, that Andy Burnham is quite flexible in both his political allegiances to the different party leaders there's been. And he's been more agile than other people who've made a success of the Labour Party. I mean, let's just pause on that. This guy was Tony Blair's special advisor. He managed to sail all the way through, become a minister and an MP in the Blair government, become a Secretary of State under Gordon Brown. Okay, he didn't win 2 leadership contests while they were in opposition, but then he was still kind of favoured by Corbyn. Like he's managed to navigate the kind of slings and arrows of the Labour Party, which by itself is pretty impressive over the last 20, 30 years, and still stay in there. He's very, committed to his ideology, which is mainly about the north of England, I think.
But also he's managed to do without being labelled a snake, which is quite good going.
Yes.
Because, under any other guise, that could be quite sneaky behaviour. But, there's a bit of chat about Is he morally flexible on taking policy positions? But no one really seems to hold it kind of ethically against him as a bad person.
No, and he's so helped by having been out of Westminster for so long that basically the best thing that could have happened to him, and apart from it's the best thing that could have happened to him because what's happened in Manchester is really good and he's done a brilliant job and it's been fantastic and it's a really important work in and of itself. It means he's absolutely been on the sidelines for all of the kind of everybody throwing shit at each other for years and years and years, and can come back in as a genuine messiah.
But you like it when people change their minds a bit, don't you?
Do you know what? I do like it when people change their minds a bit, because this notion that you should have had exactly the same views since you were, 21 is troubling. I think that he's very much branding himself, the authentic Andy trademark that we're seeing now is very much what he's been doing in Manchester since 2017 and 18, to his credit. So he has pretty much run he talks a lot left, Andy Burnham, when push comes to shove, but he behaves slightly in a broader church way in the political spectrum, I would say. He's formed really good alliances in Manchester. He's worked very sensibly with business. He's actually quite, if he can pull off this trick of sounding like a man of the people and being somebody who can actually govern in an effective way, then, things might be better. He will get a lot of people going back and finding what he has said and not said, and it will not be entirely consistent.
Well, you've worked with him, haven't you, as a government minister?
I worked for him. Yeah,
worked for him.
So
who is the authentic Andy Burnham then? TM.
So my experience of Andy. So I worked for Andy when he was Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport back in the day under the Blair and Brown government.
So is that pre-London Olympics bid?
I think he was Secretary of State under Gordon Brown, basically.
Okay.
So it was after he'd won the bid, and he'd been massively involved in football. He'd been a special advisor in Tony Blair's Number 10. He'd worked for Chris Smith. I think he's a very DCMS, and it's partly why I've got a little smile on my face, because Andy Burnham, I think more so than any modern politician, really understands that some of the strengths in this country come from all of the things in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. It's our creative industries, it's our amazing TV, it's our sport, it's our football, it's all of these things.
Very cool Britannia,
it's very
circa
cool,
Tony Blair. And I see that Oasis have said he can use their songs.
The 90s are properly back, baby. There's no bad that can come of this. But he's nice, actually. Do you know what? He genuinely is nice.
Is he competent, Helen?
Yes.
Okay. That sounded emphatic.
Well, it's like he wasn't the world's most decisive Secretary of State, it's fair to say. So he did find making a decision and sticking to something tricky. But it's a long time ago. There's no I can't think of anybody who's got a story about Andy Burnham, and the civil service has a lot of stories, right? And we all talk to each other all the time. So even the people that you might not think in the public, people who have some sort of halo, can be awful to work for. People liked working for Andy Burnham. He's quite fun. He was very committed to his wife and his kids, and he's a very proper family guy. Comedically northern, I would say, as a northerner.
Well, I think famously, when asked what his favourite biscuit is, he said
chips and gravy.
Come on.
What is there not to love about that?
All right, well, you worked with him when he was in government, and that was quite a long time ago. You were both babies then, but your last job was as Deputy Cabinet Secretary. So let's say the stakes are raised quite a bit once you come into Number 10 in the Cabinet Office. Do you think he has what it takes to be a good Prime Minister?
Yes. I know an actual straight answer. So I think what he's done in Manchester is amazing, actually. And it's not just him. And I really there's a good we've all been busy watching things that Andy Burnham has said recently, I guess. There's a really good long interview he did with Newsnight. And to his credit, he credits other people. So there was an amazing guy called Howard Bernstein, who is the civil servant version of the guy who sorted out Manchester. And Andy's very generous to him. He's generous to the other Labour leaders who they've been before him. Manchester has achieved 3% growth when the rest of the country really hasn't. And if you go to Manchester, I remember being there for the Conservative conference last year, and you step off the train, and I find this painful as a Yorkshire woman, but you think, actually, this is really great. It's really great, and it looks nice, and it's interesting, and it's buzzy. And if Andy can bring to the rest of the country what he and his team and everything else has done for Manchester, then yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I also think the Greater Manchester Police Force is outperforming everyone. It's really impressive. And in fact, they are going into other constabularies and kind of giving demonstrations and explaining how they've managed to bring crime down and how their policing works. And it would be great if he took that with him, and I would say keep Shabana Mahmood in the Home Office and put these lessons writ large across the UK.
I'm not sure mine and your love for Shabana Mahmood does her any favours, by the way.
I know. She's not even 1% in the Labour membership poll. And Al Khan's is 0, so sorry, guys.
We do not pick winners around here. The other thing that I'd say is that I hope that he manages to, if Andy Burnham is Prime Minister, so he's been very, very strong about, in all his rhetoric about Whitehall not working and Westminster not working. If he then becomes the Prime Minister and turns up and does absolutely nothing about some fundamentals, then where are we? So I would hope that one of the things that he's starting to think about is actually what does that look like? Not talking about rewiring the state, but how do you actually get accountability, purpose, sort out what's going on in Westminster and Whitehall so that that bit of the government also delivers for everyone.
Let's not forget that Keir Starmer is still the Prime Minister, and I have been feeling for him because he's had to do. He must be feeling terrible. The atmosphere in that building in these end of days stages are really depressing. So you kind of walk in, there's just a sense of dread. You're still doing the kind of charity events and bits and bobs up in the reception rooms where you have to act really cheerful. He's having to go out and do events to talk about policies and stuff, sitting in a cafe having a cup of tea, trying to look cheery. He had to look cheery going to vote in the local elections with his wife. And he can't authentically look how he actually feels, because everyone would think, my God, he looks so depressed. He looks like he's hungover almost. And we've already had the photos, the now trademark photos of Prime Minister looking appalled, leaving the Commons in the back of the ministerial jag in like high flash photography where it's a private moment.
Oh, the Thatcher Redux. Yeah.
Terrible. And they've all had it. But actually, this bit is terrible, but once it's over, once the kind of grit is over, there's actually a sense of relief, I think. And once you get over the anticlimax, there's actually a little fun period.
I hope so. I do think it is, to your point, it's just grim. I mean, so we were there together for the end of Theresa May's time, and I remember from a civil service perspective, obviously you're going to be there. So it's a slightly different dynamic. But you are feeling, so these are the people you work really closely with and the political advisors and the big boss. You can't help thinking, if you're working very closely for the Prime Minister, that you've let them down. If they've managed to, if it's gone this badly, it must be also slightly your fault. And you definitely feel a bit of that. And you feel a bit of what can we do to help make it easier? Because the personal strain and stress is awful, and you can see that. And you sort of think, how do I try to jolly this along and make these people feel cheerful? I remember
you were good at
that. Yes, I remember doing a lot of that. I remember we got the England cricket team in for Theresa May right in the last,
because they just won the World Cup.
They had. You just think, this person, whatever you think, the Prime Minister's given a massive amount of public service to the country, and they sacrifice a lot, and that is every single Prime Minister does that. And we do have cause to be grateful for them, because it's a horrible, horrible job. The other thing you remember at these times, if you're right in the centre, is who shows up. So it's quite tempting, because, people are venal and craven and like to look after themselves, that all of the really super important people who trot around when the Prime Minister's on the high just disappear when it's looking a bit shaky. And you really remember whether it is the chair of this business or this FTSE chief executive or the person from a charity, whoever it is who comes into number 10 is totally gracious and treats the Prime Minister as if they are rightly the Prime Minister of the land and nothing else is going on. You are so, so grateful to those people. It really stays with you. That's like the proper thing to do in these times.
I disappeared. I went on holiday.
You did.
But for Keir Starmer, I think it must be even worse, because I don't know if people who have seen this, but More in Common have put out a quite interesting graphic where they've asked the public, what do you think Keir Starmer's greatest achievement is? And it's one of those word association bubbles. And so the most common word comes out the biggest, and it's an enormous nothing. And it's tiny bit of Trump, tiny bit of Iran war, tiny bit of NHS waiting lists. And then when you ask what his greatest mistake has been, it's an enormous everything. I mean, it must just...
brutal.
Can you imagine feeling... It's sort of double misery because people like Wes Streeting, we've talked about this before, the Labour Party are very... They've known each other for a long time, a lot of these guys. So there's the stabbing in the back of someone who's actually a personal friend, but also just to feel like vast swathes of the public, despite you doing what you think is your best, viscerally dislike you.
Yes, absolutely. So to segue into a totally different podcast, probably, we should hope that the Arsenal win the Premier League, and that before Keir Starmer departs, he's able to entertain the Arsenal team somewhere in number 10, that he really enjoys trooping of the colour, all of the other stuff that's coming up, which is quite nice in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I agree. So hold on, Keir. It's crap for a bit longer. But then naturally, it depends. If Andy wins the by-election, you might just have a couple of days to squeeze out what enjoyment you can.
Keir Starmer could also have the last laugh here. This is a very tight by-election. We shouldn't rule out the possibility of Andy Burnham losing. And then I think all bets are off in terms of what happens to Labour leadership.
God, we won't be laughing.
No.
Let's talk a bit about our advice for Andy Burnham and perhaps even Wes Streeting going forward. I'm going to go first just because I'm feeling greedy. Step 1, win the by-election. So, get selected.
Get selected, yes.
Get selected and then win the by-election, which is no easy task. But I just want to contain our by-election fever for now. We'll talk about that another day because as people are starting to pick up, I've really got the hots for by-elections and this is a doozy. But let's just pretend that he has won the by-election and it's the 19th of June and we've woken up and Andy Burnham is the MP for Makerfield. What happens next?
So I think he needs to hit the ground running at a massive pace, even faster than he runs, actually, probably. So this needs to feel a bit like 1997 when the Labour Party came in, where they just were bang, bang, big announcement after big announcement after big announcement. It kind of set the tone for crikey. And so a really good version of Andy Burnham becoming the Prime Minister is that we're left with our heads spinning, effectively, not knowing kind of what he is, because I think that the magic that Andy Burnham can bring, if you look at what he's done in Manchester, is he can tack both left and right really quickly. So you could both renationalise the water industry and open oil and gas in the North Sea. And that would confuse the hell out of Westminster politics. I think he's genuinely got the space to make it very confusing for everybody else to work out how to oppose what he's doing. I think he has to come in and it has to feel and look really different. And of course, Labour can't afford to waste their talent. And there might be all sorts of talented people in the ministerial team who are experienced, and having wholly fresh new people who don't know their way from one end of a red box to another might not be a good idea. But the country really needs change. It needs to look and feel like change. It needs to be different. And there needs to be people who are totally loyal to Andy Burnham, and only he'll know who that is. Give us some interesting people. Give us some people with different stories. There's loads of really talented people in that intake in the Labour Party. There's loads of really talented people in the country who actually can see the situation that we are in, forget about party politics for a second, as existential for us as an economy. So hopefully, she says, a lot of hope here, hopefully Andy Burnham as Prime Minister could do the thing that I think some of us thought might happen in 2024 when Keir Starmer got in, which is that suddenly everyone rolls their sleeves up and is like, okay, fine, we'll come and help. Point us in the right direction. Tell us what to do. There's loads of people I talk to in business and the private sector who would happily fix stuff if they were asked.
Yeah, which is actually a great way to do it. One of my caveats, which is that I think Burnham and his team will feel nervous about looking ahead of the by-election vote like they are counting their chickens and that they're making these kinds of plans for government. I think they'll worry that any of it will leak and that they will look sort of arrogant in some way. But they must. One of the big criticisms of Keir Starmer coming in 2024 is that they blatantly did not have a plan. They do not have a 100-day plan. They do not have a 1,000-day plan. And so why not? I mean, resources are quite scarce. And a lot of the people you listed as being very helpful to him in Greater Manchester might be, perhaps you can send them down to have a bit of a chat with the Cabinet Office and some interesting Labour bigwigs. But beyond the focus of winning the by-election, I completely agree. Having a plan and building a team absolutely essential. What I'm quite interested in is Wes Streeting, who is not polling particularly well with, he's actually despised by a lot of Labour MPs and certainly by members of the current cabinet, and actually quite a lot of Labour members who in a head-to-head would take Keir Starmer by 18 points over Wes Streeting. And I wonder whether Burnham has a Michael Gove in 2016 opportunity, which is what Theresa took, which was to essentially banish him. Now, Michael Gove was back within a year, actually doing quite a good job of running the Environment Department, but you could certainly put Wes back in his box, and I think a lot of the Labour Party would quite like that. So Wesley Snipes, while he continues to cause problems talking about Brexit and the East India Trading Company, all kinds of random stuff like that, I think it's really worth putting him on the subs bench when the time comes. And he'll find that quite surprising, because I suspect he's hoping that he stays in contention and he's an obvious chancellor or something like that.
And I think that, yes, and I expect they all are, and it's a bit, I do appreciate it's a bit mean to be like, just bin them all. But I do think this government needs to look and feel different. I do think there are some really big things that need to happen. It sounds unbelievably boring, but it's very important that the proper devolution to local authorities, putting power back in the hands of communities. There's a brilliant set of stuff that Andy Burnham could do, but it will be opposed quite heavily in my old patch in Whitehall. So he's got to find a way of crashing through these things, but crashing through it quite bravely and boldly. And I don't know Andy's team in Manchester at all really anymore. But I would hope that he's obviously got a pattern of working that works for him. He's got a close team around him. He's got people he trusts. There must be a way of being able to translate some of that into SW1.
Yeah, with a lovely Oasis soundtrack over the top.
I mean, it sounds ideal.
What's
and
not
pies,
to like?
more pies in Whitehall. I'd be very on board with that. Sometimes Cleo politics moves really fast, and it feels like that we're in another one of those times, because 2 weeks ago we were talking about a leadership contest. We were talking about Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting and the runners and riders, and it feels like very quickly maybe their time has gone. Maybe they've blown it already.
Anything can happen, exactly as you say. So much hangs on this by-election in Makerfield, but I think Wes Streeting has already blown his chances of becoming leader of the Labour Party, because it's just not helpful. I think the way he has conducted himself, resigning when he did, actually managing to have his resignation leak first during the King's speech, people just hate that. It's bad play. You've sort of done the Brutus backstabbing, but quite candidly, because the Prime Minister's still there, and actually lots of people who've sort of warmed to his tortoise of just like staying completely still and refusing to move. He's managed to irritate Labour MPs by reopening this Brexit stuff, which most of them do understand is not about rejoining or remaining or leave, but is about a much bigger question to do with deindustrialisation and how their communities have felt that they've been left behind for a long, long time. And I just think he's got the kind of personality and politics bit wrong. He's speaking to quite a southern audience, which is fine, and where lots of Labour 2024 voters probably find themselves still. But I don't think, particularly with his own seat, which is only has a 600 majority, I just don't think he survives impact with the real world.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's perfectly possible that Wes and Angela have blown it by not acting early enough. They could have come for Keir Starmer months and months ago. And because Andy Burnham has now, because of the selection of this seat for the by-election, has now made the contest and the competition and the battle for ideas completely different, and it's happened like that.
Totally. And actually, people were saying, do you remember Andy Burnham had a crack at taking Keir Starmer down in the autumn ahead of Labour Party conference? And then everyone said, Andy's back in his box and he's had to go away and lick his wounds. And then, this Madison stuff dropped January, February. The Prime Minister lost Morgan McSweeney and a Cabinet Secretary. Like, there was a perfect opportunity to strike then too. Instead, they've kind of tripped over each other in the very late stages now, where Keir Starmer is essentially still holding the ball. No one's managed to get it off him, but they've managed to kind of cleat each other in the face with their study boots. And it's just a bit of a disaster.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Remember to follow the show on your podcast player of choice and give us a 5-star review if you enjoyed it.
And do please email us with feedback and questions. Our email address is intheroom@independent.com. www.intherinroom.co.uk. And if you're listening on Spotify, you can leave little comments under today's episode. And you can keep up with all the best bits of the show on Instagram at intheroom.pod.
This podcast is part of the Independent Podcast Network and produced in association with Next Chapter Studios.
The executive producers are Carrie Rose and Olivia Foster, and the producer is Sam Durham.
A special mention to our content editor Maya Wanushka, video editor Vali Raza, and videographer Dan Faber.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.